Welcome to another edition of the Magic Latest Podcast, a podcast where we discuss everything Orlando Magic basketball. I'm your host, Jalon Dixon, and today we've got a bunch of things to get into. But before we get started, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for daily Orlando Magic content. We are on the road to 1,000 subscribers and trying to become one of the biggest Orlando Magic podcasts here on the YouTube platform. So remember to hit that post notification bell so you always know when we're dropping new videos. And let's go ahead and get right into it. So today, with the Orlando Magic having an off day after a back-to-back, I figured today would be a really good day to delve into the comment section and let that be the driving force of today's episode. Thankfully, you guys were very active on last episode, and that provided me a lot of content to work with, both positive and negative responses. And I want to take the opportunity in today's episode to kind of build out the topics around the highs and the lows of some of the things that people had to say in response to last episode, whether it was in response to Jet Howard and Jace Richardson and my take on them, or Noah Penda being an emerging power forward for this team, or even the LaMelo Ball trade acquisition conversation, which was mainly stirred around a report that actually pointed to the idea of the Orlando Magic not going after LaMelo Ball and actually imploring the Orlando Magic not to trade for LaMelo Ball, but nonetheless at least acknowledging that there are reports out there that have indicated the Orlando Magic have had interest in LaMelo Ball. As we all know, that has been something that's come up in the past. That was a conversation that took place a lot during the offseason as well. I think I even have a video on the channel where we discussed LaMelo Ball as a potential trade chip prior to the Desmond Bane trade. And I think maybe even after the Desmond Bane trade, as far as trying to get a point guard who is more of a facilitator, right? This was prior to Tyus Jones being acquired, I believe, and that was one of the bigger conversations there. So in the comment section, each segment of today's video will have about 2 or 3 comments that were typically associated with it. If it was something that I felt like I saw more than one comment related to, I felt like it was worth creating a topic on today's episode about. So the very first one that we're going to address is the Jet Howard debate. And what I mean by that is everybody knows, and I've made it very clear on this podcast more than a handful of times. So it's something that I understand, and I would hope avid listeners are very understanding of, is that I've had a wishy-washy relationship with Jet Howard from the very beginning, as a person who identified him as a talent that was probably more graded around the 20s in terms of where he probably should have been drafted, and was taken significantly higher as a lottery pick. And so with that being the case, as somebody that does not have a crazy sample size in today's NBA as far as starts, as far as minutes played and things of that nature, he's somebody that for being drafted so high, I've had real question marks about. In his rookie season, he only played 13 games, 10 minutes a game. Last season, he played 60 games, and he ends up playing in about 12 minutes per game. And his actual stats as far as his shooting percentages and things like that actually take a bit of a dip with the increased action on the floor, to be very specific. So it's not me just kind of stating it lightly. Yes, he goes from 33% shooting from the field to 37.4% from the field on double the shot attempts, which went from 2 to essentially 5. He goes from 28 to just under 30% on 1.5 3-point attempts to 3.1. Again, doubling his percentage. Free throw attempts. Sit there and he goes from 50% from the free throw line on barely a free throw attempt per game to just under 70% on barely a free throw per game. And you can say, sure, he went from 1.6 points to 4.5. But when you look at it, linearly speaking, he did not improve from year 1 to year 2, despite getting nearly, over triple the games played from season 1 to season 2. All that happened was that his statistics doubled in conjunction to his productivity on the floor being doubled or tripled as far as the amount of games he played. All he did was have a bigger sample size, which made the number inflated. But as far as truly improving, none of the statistics improved in a significant way, where from year 1 to year 2 with more time on the floor, granted, again, only 12 minutes per game. I'm not going to sit here and make it sound like Mosley was giving him mad time and he just didn't maximize it. But this is a player through the first 78 games of his career did not show a ton of promise, especially when, regardless if you want to say there's a slight percentage increase in his three-point shooting percentage last season, 30% as a three-point shooter when you were drafted top 14, taken in the lottery for being considered as a knockdown three-point shooter is cause to pause. What is this in response to? Because I want to use a few, again, I want to use a few of you guys' comments to truly drive this. KJB Christian said, just dump Tyus, play Jet and Jace, and we good. It's unbelievable how Tyus can get minutes on this team. D-Lo Florida says, I was looking at Jet come in the game, and I made a joke that Jet never took off. I walked away for 3 minutes, came back, and he took flight. I want you to see the dichotomy between just those two comments. Excuse me. I want you to see the difference between just those two comments alone, both an hour posted between one another, where one simply says, it's time to move off of Tyus. Let the boys rock. Talking about Jet Howard and Jace Richardson. The next comment after says, I saw Jet Howard come in the game, and essentially I rolled my eyes at the idea of what I thought he would be able to do on the floor, only to see him come out and absolutely thrive in his time. I think that goes to show you there's a bit of a conundrum even amongst Orlando Magic fans when it comes to Jet Howard. Next comment from WL8. Shout out to you as usual. Tim tends to be very active in my comment section. Said you hit the nail in the head. I've been saying this. I'm assuming that he's in relation to the Jet Howard stuff. I'm assuming that that's in relation to my thoughts on Franz Wagner as a number one and how good he's been able to thrive in this role without Paulo Banchero active. I think that's really important. This next one from Luis Rosario, I think is also very telling. Jet, Jace, and Penda made it clear to the coaches and Weltman that they are getting ready to take over and it's time to trim the fat and let some people go, like Tyus and J.I. We're going to talk about the Tyus and J.I. conversations a little bit more as we progress through the podcast, but just keep that in your mind that the conversation is already starting to spiral amongst Orlando Magic fans of the idea of trying to, as he stated, I think this is a good way to phrase it, trim the fat in a way that positions this team to start really prepping themselves for what should be a real playoff rotation, which is the overall goal of this year, is not just to make the postseason, but to do so in a way where they actually are truly a competitive team this year. Another comment from D-Lo Florida literally says, I think it's time to figure out the trade value of J.I. and Tyus after last night. Free Jace in the comment section. Totally understand that, because this is the thing. And this is the comment that triggered it, but I also think that there's a couple of things to really work with here. The comment from iCobby F4Q, and he was very active in this comment section. Shout out to you, by the way. All respect, because at the end of the day, I am very open to the conversation about the Orlando Magic, because again, it also gives me a chance to get a understanding of where the Orlando Magic fan base is. Not everybody is on the side where I am. Not everybody is in the middle. Some people are far on the opposite end in terms of some of the things that I believe about this team. And it creates a debate and it creates a conversation that's healthy within this community, because it also gives you an overall understanding of what the expectations for this team is this year. And I thought this was really important. I like the way he phrased it, by the way. He said, some of you wishy-washy fans, some of us been saying Howard is a baller for a while. Most of you want to trade him now after one game, and Penda is the way to go. I'm not saying they're not ready, but it will be the same fans criticizing if they get the chance. Don't immediately meet y'all expectations. So the best way to phrase that so that it comes out in a way that's a little bit easier to understand, because even I struggled reading it at the moment, but I think the premise of it is still really important. The main point of that comment, and I understand what he's saying, is there's a lot of people, including myself, that see that game from Jet Howard and start to preach the idea of maybe he needs more minutes. Let's see what we can get out of him. What does he look like if he is able to play with a more expanded role? And that's coming after a very good game, as in relation to what my more solidified take on Jet Howard has been so far since starting the podcast is that I'm not necessarily sure where he fits on this roster long term. And I've said that on a multitude of occasions, and I still stand by that. Even in that same episode, I made it very clear that I thought it would be interesting that if this Orlando Magic team were not able to put together the financial scratch to go after someone like a Malik Monk, for example, to have that punch off the bench, that I don't believe that Jet Howard singularly is able to make up that archetype of the microwave scorer off the bench. I made it very clear in that section of the podcast. I believe that maybe you have to do this in the form of a two for the price of one type of scenario, where maybe you do it in the form of having both Jet Howard and Jace Richardson take up a lot of what were those Tyus Jones minutes, and now you position yourself to get it from two different guards in the backcourt that can give you two totally different flows, because Jet Howard may be better as a ball mover and maybe much faster to the trigger as far as pulling it from beyond the arc. But Jace Richardson, I think, is a better individual shot creator off the bounce. And that gives you a totally different element where those two guys can work off of one another while still providing the skill set that maybe you would get from one player in like a Malik Monk or like a Russell Westbrook or someone of that nature that we've talked about on the podcast plenty of times before. So I don't want it to be taken out of context here that I'm not all of a sudden a Jet Howard believer because of one game, but I do believe that the most important thing when you're covering a team every single day is to understand that sample size is going to be the biggest best friend of you when it comes to creating content and making decisions about where you stand on individual players or the team. And I think the biggest thing, and I've said this on the podcast so many times, and it'll give us a good chance to be able to transition to the Tyus question, is I've believed for some time now that the sample size on Tyus Jones has not been great this season. And it's created an avenue to potentially unlock maybe a Jet Howard, unlock a Jace Richardson. And I said even prior to the season starting that I believe that two guard position coming off the bench was still really up for grabs. I made that very clear before the season started that I felt like Anthony Black off the bench was sealed. His spot at the number one off the bench, first man off the bench at six-man spot was a done deal. The question was whether or not Tyus Jones would be the answer as that off guard, two guard, who in that lineup would essentially run as the one, but in reality would be somebody that is more of the off guard in that scenario, which meant that it was going to be up for a Jace Richardson and a Jet Howard to kind of play themselves into contention for minutes at that spot. And in a 20-game sample size, granted, although the difference between Jet Howard and Jace Richardson in terms of how many minutes they've played in comparison to someone like Tyus Jones is very significant this season, the glaring factor here is that they have been more impactful in the time that they've been on the floor than when Tyus Jones has been on the floor. And I think that's the most important thing now, is to start really having conversations about what that sample size means for this team moving forward when you're talking about the idea of, again, shoring up this roster where you have a clear understanding of what your 9 to 10 man rotation looks like, because that's going to be the thing that really tells the tape here. Speaking of the Tyus Jones element, and again, a free Jace was something that I felt like was really a glaring comment in this comment section, because of the fact that I feel like even with what Jet Howard did, I feel like Jace is still arguably the more talented player overall. But here's a comment from Carlos Diaz 8907. Again, another very active player within my comment section. Avid commenter within my comment section that says, I've been saying it in this podcast for a couple of weeks, and he has, that Mosley is giving Tyus too much respect because of a veteran status, but he is holding back the future of Jace. I'm not a coach or anyone with a lot of knowledge, but even a blind person could see it. Tyus is giving the team nothing. Give the kid a chance, and because of the cap situation on next year, you will need a big contribution from rookie contract players. Even Penda should get some consistent play in time. Look at his performance last night. Thank you for your good analysis, bro. Thank you for your good response. But more importantly, that is the focus. The idea for this team is, and I touched on it a little bit in the LaMelo Ball section about the cap flexibility of this team. For example, they don't really even have the scratch financially to make any type of move, even for a veteran minimum caliber player, until at least January 15th, right? So it puts them in a really big bind where they're going to have to rely on this roster kind of as is for the most part. And I think that's the reality of the Orlando Magic moving forward. We talk about trade conversations a lot on this podcast, and it's just mainly because, I mean, if a player is associated with your favorite team and there's a report that says that that's something that could be a possibility, we're going to cover it. Again, we cover this team every single day. If news comes out that all of a sudden Anthony Davis was a potential player for the Orlando Magic, yeah, we're going to talk about it. We talked about the Miami Heat when they were at the top of the conversation for Anthony Davis, and that had a lot to do with the in-conference impact of a move like that. So, of course, if there's any kind of trade conversation that comes up that could impact the Orlando Magic, whether it's on their roster or someone else's, we're going to discuss it. But Tyus Jones in particular and what it means for this roster moving forward, I think we're coming to a point where if you're simply using your eyes and you're going off of if you're going based off of what we see on the floor, you're getting to a point where I think, again, the veteranship aspect is the one where you really want to rein yourself in as Coach Mosley. You do not want to alienate what is still a very young basketball team by giving minutes to players that are not performing to the caliber of being deserving of said minutes. I think that's very important to touch on as well. So the Tyus Jones element, I think, is very important. Let me touch on something else that iCobby F4Q said, because, again, he was very active in the comment section. I want to give him his flowers, even if it wasn't necessarily positive responses across the board in terms of what my analysis was. But he said, the host, meaning me, is bugging, probably needs to be doing Chicago games. I mean, I admitted one time on the podcast that I am a Chicago Bulls fan before a Orlando Magic fan, just simply at birth. And all of a sudden I should be covering Chicago games. I mean, if you can hook me up, I'm totally open. But nonetheless, always talking about trading someone. How you going from wanting to trade Howard to basically want to give him black minutes after a good fourth, as if you haven't seen the same thing around the league where players who average around 3 points get some playing time and put up over 30, then go back to their regular average. So here's the funny part about that, right? Is number one, no one indicated that there should be any version of this team that plays Jet Howard to the same degree as they play Anthony Black. If anything, I actually made it very clear that Anthony Black is going to be the guy who upsets the apple cart as far as being able to fully unlock both Jet Howard and Jace Richardson, because when he gets relegated back to coming off the bench as the sixth man when Jalen Suggs is on the floor, that bumps everybody down a notch. So let's say even if you take away the Tyus Jones minutes and you start to give him the DMP CDs, right? You're still in a situation where, as far as that two guard position is concerned, you only can really lean into one of either Jace Richardson or Jet Howard. Otherwise, you're committing to the idea of playing more of a small ball lineup, something I'm not necessarily opposed to. It might have a little bit more speed element to it if you have Jet, Jace, and Anthony Black all on the floor at the same time. Anthony Black at 6'7" could be somebody that could play as a quote-unquote small forward in that lineup for you, and that's an interesting way to go about it. But the truth of the matter is there's no route where you're going to be able to give Jet Howard those kind of minutes if you also truly believe in Jace Richardson the way that I do, or the way that many in the fan base do. So Jet Howard and Jace Richardson are kind of going to have to be two people of the same coin, as I mentioned in the last podcast about how I think they could be really impactful in maybe a reduced role, operating as like these flamethrower scorers in the backcourt that take on the role of the 1 man of the year hyper scorer type, your Malik Monk, your Jamal Crawford, your Lou Williams, right? Usually that comes in the form of one player. And usually the idea here especially for a team that's looking to make a real postseason run, would be maybe to consolidate the two of these guys, Jace Richardson and Jet Howard, into maybe one player who fully fits the archetype through and through. But instead of given the financial situation of this team, they may not have the likelihood of being able to do that where they can flip players to get that archetypal individual on the bench. So instead, you might have to do that by, again, sacrificing someone like a Tyus Jones, or you might have to clip minutes from Jonathan Isaac, who we'll get to in a minute when we get to the trade conversations aspect as well. You might have to do it internally by taking away minutes from guys who are not being, true contributors this season, and put them in a position where they now they're seeing the guys who are being the most productive. It's not going from trading Jet Howard because I didn't believe in him to all of a sudden believing he should be the sixth man off the bench. It goes from believing that Jet Howard is our best trade chip given his upside, and he would have to be paired with somebody of a lucrative contract if he were to be moved, which is why Jonathan Isaac always comes up. We'll talk about him in a minute. Again, he's owed $14 million every single season on a continuing contract, and his contract is also one that is very steady over the course of his time with Orlando. So he stays at about 14 to 15 million consistently. But again, I don't want to get too ahead of myself. So Jet is somebody that he is the best. When you talk about any Orlando Magic trade, it's going to start with either something outlandish like trading Franz or Paolo, or it's going to be something more minuscule where you have to give them at least some kind of high upside prospect, which would likely be Jet Howard, because you're not going to trade Jace Richardson after just drafting him and wanting to see what he wants to do. You're not moving off of Anthony Black. Goga Batazde is soon to be an expiring contract within the next year and a half. And beyond that, there's not too many quote-unquote blue chip prospects that could maybe garner the attention of being able to get a valuable piece in return. And then, of course, Jonathan Isaac can't be the quote-unquote sweetener because he's playing his position in any trade is simply to help with making the salaries equal out. So there's all of that. So I think the biggest thing is that I believe that Jet Howard and Jace Richardson together are what is phasing Tyus Jones out of the picture through this first 18 to 20 game sample size, paired with the fact that Tyus Jones isn't doing himself any favors. Let's talk about the trade conversation, because I don't want to necessarily dwell on that too much longer, because I think that it's time to really address the elephant in the room when we talk about this page. And there were a few comments that I thought were kind of telling, maybe a little hurtful here and there, but nothing worth getting your pride hurt over, right? Which is, let's start with this comment from Ephraim Bolden 7892. Shout out to you, boss. Nonetheless, what he said was, for a second, I thought you knew basketball. J.I. is the anchor to the Magic. Why get rid of him? You crazy as hell. I think maybe your understanding of Jonathan Isaac over the last handful of seasons is not fully there as far as what his contributions are. You said that you wonder as to whether or not I know basketball. When it came to Jonathan Isaac, I pointed out specifically things that were statistically indicating his lack of contribution on the floor this season. This season, he's had nearly double-digit games where he only played in the single figures as far as minutes played on the floor. That's a fact. His rim contest numbers have declined. That's a fact. His minutes per game have been settled around where he has not been able to overtake 16 minutes in a singular game this season. That is a fact. See, the thing about Jonathan Isaac is it's funny that people think that there's some kind of opinionated viewpoint on Jonathan Isaac when there's not really much to make an opinion about. The only thing that I know is a fact is that he has not been a big-time contributor for this team. He can't be the anchor of a defense when he's playing 4 minutes in a game where the second unit single-handedly brought the Orlando Magic back into this game. Why was Jonathan Isaac, who's not a part of the starting unit by any means, unable to even crack double-digit minutes played in that game against the Boston Celtics? In a game with no Goga Batazde and no Wendell Carter Jr., it was Orlando Robinson who got the start. But Jonathan Isaac is supposed to be the linchpin of the defense. He's supposed to be the heart and soul of the team. He's supposed to be this quote unquote anchor to the Magic. Yet he only got 4 minutes in a game where the Orlando Robinson experience was in full effect because he got to start the game. Again, no Mo Wagner, no Paolo Banchero, no Goga Batazde, and no Wendell Carter Jr. And Jonathan Isaac played 4 minutes. But he's considered an anchor. Doesn't make any sense. Why get rid of him? Let me tell you why you get rid of him. Because the same player that I just said only played 4 minutes and didn't even get to start over Orlando Robinson. No disrespect to Orlando Robinson. Very good two-way pickup for this team and is playing his role right now. Jonathan Isaac played 4 minutes. And he's the 5th highest player on the team this season. Let me read the order for you so you guys understand the drop-off here. Franz Wagner is making $38.6 million this year. Desmond Bane making $36.7 million this year. Jalen Suggs is making $35 million this year. Paolo Banchero's extension doesn't kick in until next season. He's making $15.3 million this year. Paolo Banchero's making $15.3 million this season. And he's our best player. Jonathan Isaac is making $15 million this season and can't crack double-digit minutes played in a game where three of our main four front court rotation players were injured. Wendell Carter Jr., our starting center, makes $10.8 million. Why do you trade Jonathan Isaac? Because Jonathan Isaac, after this season, is owed $14 million for 2026, 27, 2027, 28, and 2028, 29. The next 3 seasons, he's averaging $14.5 million, $14.5 million, and then escalates back up to $15 million at his age 31 season. He's going to be making $15 million, which, don't get me wrong, in today's NBA is a very respectable budget baller price, except he's not producing at that level. Should I give you the info on how that compares to some of the other more notable players on our team? Someone like Wendell Carter Jr. is only going to be making $3 million more than him next season, $18 million. The year after that, $19.5. The year after that is a club option for $20.9. But all of that to say that Jonathan Isaac, who can barely crack double figures, minutes played. We're not talking about points. We're not talking about rebounds. We're talking about minutes played. Can barely crack over 15 minutes a game, is going to be consistently making nearly as much as our starting center. That's why you trade him. That's why you get rid of him. That's how you get to the point where you realize he is no longer the kind of contributor that the theoretical version of Jonathan Isaac is always presented. Jonathan Isaac is as much of a per-minute MVP as Joel Embiid when healthy. Guess what? Joel Embiid's going to kill in the 35 games he plays every single season. But he can't be eligible for All-NBA because he got to play 65 and he's about 30 short. And that's Jonathan Isaac. He's going to kill in his 10 minutes to 12 minutes on the floor on a night-to-night basis. But guess what? Even if he plays 70 games, his impact on the floor is so minuscule in the grand scheme of this team, enough to call him an anchor of anything. It doesn't really work. And for a team that, again, is trying to really shore up their playoff rotation, which should be, the number one goal of this team, is to figure out who their main 9 are going to be when it comes time to go to the postseason. That's not going to work. But let's focus more on the trade aspect of it, right? Because I feel like, again, a handful of comments. I mentioned earlier, one of the most interesting comments I saw was that you might want to get to the point of really seeing what the trade value of someone like Tyus and Jace are. Shout out to Luis Rosario, who said that earlier on, talking about trimming the fat. Again, anchor of our defense, but you have Orlando Magic fans deeming him as the fat for this team. D'Lo Florida again said we might need to figure out what the value of J.I. and Tyus are after last night. And yes, you do make the phone call. You at least make the phone call, of course, because any good general manager should at least see what the value on a $14 to $15 million player is. Now, the other thing too is in relation to the LaMelo Ball conversation. I saw that. I saw the comments, and for what it's worth, I think at this point in the season, conversations around making blockbuster level trades are a little bit above the head. Again, I have to make this very clear for people who are avid listeners of the podcast. If it's news related to the Orlando Magic, it's getting brought up on the show. I have a 5-day-a-week show where we talk about nothing but the Orlando Magic. So if the Orlando Magic even get a whiff of a conversation for Keon Ellis while the Sacramento Kings are doing a fire sale right now, or Anthony Davis with what the Dallas Mavericks have been in the news for, or Ja Morant with the saga that's going on over there as far as him being a potential trade candidate. If there's even an iota of Orlando Magic mentioned in a conversation around any version of a trade asset, that's gonna be something we discuss on the podcast. And I don't want to overblow it. If the thumbnail had to have who's a player the thumbnail could be Chris Middleton, who we discussed on the podcast, who shout out to Luis Rosario, was one of the people who helped with bringing up that one of those interesting names. Carlos Diaz 8907 also gave a handful of interesting suggestions in the past for different trade targets. It could be someone as far as like another, reliable 3-man knockdown shooter type. Like one of my favorite, again, archetypes in the NBA is the glue guy. That's why I've always been so favorable towards Tyus Jones in the past. Another guy who fits that mold as a North Carolina Tar Heels fan is Harrison Barnes. If Harrison Barnes had to be in the thumbnail because he was in discussion as a potential trade target for the Orlando Magic, he'd be in the thumbnail. Would you guys click on it and be excited about Harrison Barnes? Probably not. But if he's in the conversation as somebody that the Orlando Magic could be targeting, we're going to talk about him. So I want to preface this by saying I'm not just here on the podcast talking about trades for the sake of trying to stir things up around a potential trade. Not every single time I see a trade rumor do I believe that that's a player we should trade for. I try my best to make that very clear. And convey that very straightforward in the episodes. But just in case I'm not doing a great job of it, let me make that very clear. I only bring these trade conversations to the table because I genuinely believe that if they're being brought to the Orlando Magic's attention, it's being reported, that by proxy, on a 5-day-a-week show where it's everything Orlando Magic, 4 topics a day, that's going to be a topic if it's something that realistically has any version of traction to it. There's people on fan-sided and things of that nature. Shout out to our guys over at Orlando Magic Daily who come up with these hypothetical trade scenarios as ways to, yes, fill content, but also base it off of reports that are built around the league. If a guy becomes available and he fits an archetype that would fit well with the Orlando Magic, they write an article on it. If a guy becomes available and it's a guy that the Orlando Magic are on their short list or on their long list of potential fit places to land, they write about it. And the same thing goes for this podcast as well. So I just kind of want to throw that out there as well, because I don't want it to be one of those things where it feels like we're over here making content built around the trade machine. I actually try my best not to over lean into the trade machine conversations. Of course, in the off season, you have no choice. That's the only thing you can really lean into as far as having consistent content is hypotheticals. But once the season actually starts and we're talking about basketball, I think my main focus has always been trying to touch on the X's and O's aspect, or just how everybody competes on a day-to-day basis. But I want to read this comment from Alpha Melanin. Shout out to you, boss, who is kind of going to cap off this section of the podcast. I'll do my question of the day and then we'll get out of here, which is, I'm going to pass on LaMelo. As fun as his play style is, I don't think he fits the culture. His whole career has been the draw. But has never played winning basketball. Magic philosophy is commit on D, and by committee, Melo is let me try and make this highlight. D is optional. Pause. The price tag would be too steep. I would rather have his brother, Lonzo, not Jello. We already have a song to play. LOL, always love the pod. Go Magic. Thank you, boss. And actually, it's funny you mentioned that. Lonzo Ball was brought up in the offseason. We discussed him on the podcast as a guy who would be an interesting connecting piece. The only issue was that the Cleveland Cavaliers made the trade to go out and get him first, and the likelihood he was going to get reflipped was very low because they went out and got Lonzo Ball to make up for A, moving off of Isaac Okoro, and B, understanding the injury history of someone like Darius Garland. Also paired with the fact that they no longer have Ricky Rubio because of, occurrences from last season that's led him to retire and so on and so forth. So their backup point guard position, granted, although it does still have, Craig Porter and things of that nature, like Lonzo Ball is just still an upgrade in terms of his overall intangibles. I think Lonzo would be a better fit overall for this team. Do I think he's available? By any means, no. Do I think of all teams with the Cleveland Cavaliers send him to the Orlando Magic? Absolutely not. But do I think he would be a much better fit? Yes. I think it goes back to what I just said a second ago. If Lonzo Ball was in the trade market with the Orlando Magic as one of the top teams in conversation for him, he'd be on the thumbnail just as much as LaMelo Ball is, because the idea of his potential fit on the team is one worth discussing, not only to give my thoughts on, but to gauge the community like guys like Alpha Melanin in terms of how you would feel if he was on our team. Because I do think that someone like Lonzo, despite the fact that he's not shooting the three ball very well this season, provides a real up-tempo offense in terms of moving the ball up the floor, being a connector, being able to make the most out of his drives, despite the fact that he tends to lean more towards trying to create opportunities for others more than actually finding his own shot. That's always been my biggest concern about Lonzo since coming to the league, is that he's almost too timid with the basketball as a scorer, but he's very aggressive as far as trying to push pace and facilitate. I think that could be something where actually his timidness could play as a positive factor for a team like the Orlando Magic, because you don't need him to score. You got Desmond Bane, you got Franz Wagner, you got Paulo Banchero. You don't need him to be aggressive as a scoring option. You just need him to be aggressive in getting those guys the ball as quickly as humanly possible in the spots that work best for them. So I think he would be actually a really great fit, but I think that goes to tell you that this Orlando Magic team has still very significant flaws here and there, as every basketball team does, I believe, in a way that you're always going to be trying to formulate ways to make the roster better, whether it's financially responsible, whether it's actually financially doable. You're always going to be thinking about these opportunities where, again, we talked about LaMelo Ball last podcast, but Melanin brought up a really good point about his brother being maybe a better fit, and I actually agree. I truly agree. Chris Middleton was brought to my attention an episode prior, and I never even thought about him as a potential option on this team. But when I factor in the conversation we had about Draymond Green talking about needing a go-to shot for Paulo Banchero and not having enough veteran presence in the locker room, Chris Middleton was a name I never thought of, but sparked an interest for me because he actually would be an interesting knockdown threat at the three position coming off the bench for this team. And if I'm not mistaken, I think he did end up making a thumbnail. I think he did. Let me double check. If he didn't, that's my fault. He didn't. And that's okay. He didn't make the thumbnail. But he should be. He should be somebody that should end up having real conversation here, because he fits. The overarching question of this section is, should the Magic consider any trades or trade targets or stay put? If you think they shouldn't make any trades at all this season, ride it out with the fellas they got on the floor and see what they have. Drop that in the comment section down below. If you think there's still a trade to be made, the missing cherry on top for this team to really put them into that championship conversation, who should they target? And who do you think is on the chopping block? Who do you think realistically is the guy or guys they would have to move in order to go after a significant trade option? And remember, that trade option doesn't have to be Anthony Davis and LaMelo Ball. I think that an archetype like Lonzo is interesting, a la someone like free my dog Keon Ellis in Sacramento. I've mentioned him on this podcast a handful of times as a guy that I think would be an interesting fit on this team because of the defense and the fact that he brings 40% off catch and shoot opportunities from beyond the arc. He's somebody who could be a floor spacer and does play defense. And his main thing is to guard in space. He's very good in zone. He's very good in zone defense. He's very good as a man-to-man defender, and he can shoot the three at a high clip. And he doesn't demand the ball too much, if at all, really. If we're being honest, he only plays about 18 minutes a game for Sacramento. You guys let me know in the comment section how you feel about that. Last but not least, something that I did take away from all of this, whether it's the conversations around Jet or the conversations around all of the trade stuff in terms of the podcast and things of that nature, is we're basically at about the quarter mark of the NBA season, right? Once you get to about 20 to 22 games, that puts us right around the quarter mark of the NBA season. So with that being said, I want to know from you guys, and I want to do this every single quarter. So just about every 18 to 20 games, I'm going to ask the same question because it helps me, right? I think it's most important that I get an understanding of the kind of things you guys want to see and hear about. What kind of content do you guys enjoy the most in basketball coverage? Do you like talking about NBA draft prospects? At the end of the day, there's not too much of a sample size on guys just yet. Most colleges have only played maybe about 4 or 5 games so far this season, but there are already NBA big boards out. There are already take-a-thon simulations that have been written about, and we can also do our own here on the podcast, where I mean, of course, the Orlando Magic are in a bit of a weird spot as far as their draft picks are concerned, but it could be something that could affect the Eastern Conference, for example, and maybe that impacts the Orlando Magic based off of how a particular mock draft or something like that plays out. Maybe it's one of those things where we respond to a mock draft where we see what player the Memphis Grizzlies are mocked to get with the Orlando Magic pick that we gave them for this upcoming season, right? Maybe we look into it where we look into the second round, where if the Orlando Magic have a viable second round pick, maybe we discuss what the idea of what they could do in the second round with another budget baller to help fit their roster looks like, a la maybe being able to get another steal similar to Noah Penda, those kind of things. So are you interested in NBA draft content? Are you interested in player breakdowns? The way, I think at one point during the summer, I put a real big emphasis on going down our roster and talking about the strengths and weaknesses of guys. Well, now we have a decent sample size of how they've played so far this season. Would you guys like me to do more in-depth breakdowns on individual players who are either having good seasons or bad seasons, and not just saying, oh, he shot this percentage, he's getting to the rim this much, but really get into the weeds of what's made them a solid player so far this season? I'm totally open to that. And obviously another thing is, do you guys like the trade scenario conversations? I mean, there's some of you that are not as big on it, and I'm totally understanding of that as well. But if there's a good handful of you that like the idea of me touching on these different trade options, different trade targets, and guys who could be acquired or should at least be called about as terms of making this Orlando Magic team better, I'm going to keep doing it. If you guys don't enjoy it as much as a collective, I'll take that in consideration in terms of how much I feature it. It'll still probably be talked about on the podcast when they are in real contention for a guy. But if it was just their name was mentioned in passing, maybe I won't talk about it nearly as much if you guys are not as big on that kind of content. But this is a long-winded way and a very open related conversation to you guys to give you guys the power over the podcast. We're a quarter of the way into the season. You've seen what my off-season content looks like if you're an avid follower, and you've also seen through about 20 games, nearly 20 games, how I go about covering this team on a game-to-game basis. What stuff do you guys like the most? What stuff could you guys do without? What stuff do you guys like to see in moderation? I'm interested in hearing what all of you guys have to say in the comment section down below about that, because I do want to tailor this next quarter of the season around that, and then we'll have this conversation again, and we'll tailor it around that once again when we get closer to things like the trade deadline and things like that too. So we'll continue to kind of tailor this as we go along, but this is you guys' podcast just as much as it's mine, which is why I dedicated a whole episode today to responding to the comments, good, bad, and indifferent. Is because you guys' opinions are the most important in terms of really being able to create this content and also get an understanding of what it is that the Orlando Magic fan base is feeling as a whole, right? All the different opinions amongst you all, right? But that all being said, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for daily Orlando Magic content. Again, we're on the road to 1,000 subscribers, trying to see if we can do it before the end of 2025, man. So hit that post notification bell so you always know when we're dropping new videos. I'll see you guys again tomorrow, but until then, peace.